In the 1860s, the United States of America experienced its greatest misfortune ever, a civil war that caused an unimaginable number of American casualties that would take more than a century to pass in tragedy. The United States split because of sectional differences in the North and South, yet some antebellum statesmen sought to stop this impending crisis. Each were throwing concepts and biases about compromise. However, Henry Clay of Kentucky was the most successful and impartial when creating compromises to stand against the dangers of a divided Union. Henry Clay took a stand against sectionalism in the United States by inciting nationalism, campaigning for moderate opinions, and fostering cooperation in Congress. Henry Clay was born in Hanover County, Virginia, and moved to Lexington, Kentucky shortly after receiving his certificate to practice law. He became very popular in Kentucky due to his socialite nature and was a very successful lawyer, even defending former Vice President Aaron Burr on charges of treason. Henry Clay was the quintessential American and Kentuckian. He loved drinking, socializing, and horse racing. As a politician, he was an eloquent speaker and a powerful unionist who rose to hold powerful positions in the United States government, such as Speaker of the House and Secretary of State. Clay used his power and political abilities to compromise with the country's diverse regions and unite the pugnacious states despite deep sectional differences. In the 1800s, America was divided, physically and ideologically, along the Mason-Dixon line. The highly industrialized North had outlawed slavery, while in the agrarian South, slavery was still a deeply embedded institution. While Southern distrust of Northern banking and cultural divides played a part in this sectionalism, the main source of conflict was slavery. In the 1700s, tobacco reigned the supreme economic power of the South. The planter class owned slaves and indentured servants. Founding Father George Washington, despite owning slaves himself, wrote, "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." The slavery of the 1700s was declining, as many tobacco plantations found little use for slaves due to rising costs and falling profits. But this all changed with the creation of the cotton gin by inventor Eli Whitney. The cotton gin revived slavery, but it morphed it into a more barbaric practice. These slaves had almost no rights and were seen as subhuman, barely better than animals. They worked for very long hours, and most were born and died as slaves. Northern abolitionists were appalled by this new form of slavery and worked to end the institution or contain it to the South. The country was being split between slave and free states. This meant that there was a race westward to tip the balance between freedom and slavery in the Senate. Clay knew that the divide over slavery would tear the country in half. He fought for compromise at every opportunity by inciting a new American patriotism, using his elegant speaking and campaigning for compromise. In the early years of the United States, patriotism was almost non-existent. American denizens saw themselves as members of the country in which they were born and not Americans. Henry Clay wanted to change this anti-patriotic way of thinking by inciting the War of 1812. As a young congressman, Clay saw an opportunity to expand and unite the country by inciting war with Britain with a goal to take control of the vulnerable Canada. He and other supporters of the war were called war hawks. This group reinforced their call to action with speeches in Congress, and the country went to war with Great Britain. Clay did not predict a negative outcome for this war. Initially, the war was considered a humiliating stalemate. But the Americans had one saving grace. Andrew Jackson expertly defended New Orleans in a rousing American victory. The War of 1812 roused the nation's spirit and propelled the war hawks and military heroes into the forefront of American politics. The nation gained more unity after the War of 1812 than ever before, and Henry Clay sought to capitalize on this newfound patriotism to gain even more harmony for the young country using his American system. The American system was a revival of Hamiltonian federalism, which worked to create high protective tariffs, a stable currency supported by a secure banking system, internal improvements, and a high federal income. Henry Clay argued for his American system by appealing to all sections of America. In Congress, he said, "The existing prosperity will be preserved and augmented, and the nation will continue rapidly to advance in wealth, power, and greatness, without prejudice to any section of the Confederacy." Clay succeeded with his endeavor in the early 1800s. In 1816, a strong bank was chartered, High tariffs remained until 1832, and the only element of his plan to be rejected was the push for internal improvements. The American system increased national unity and prosperity. Increased trade between the North and the South created by Henry Clay staved off sectionalism that would plague the country in the later parts of the century. Henry Clay desired the highest office in the land, the Presidency of the United States, hopefully ensuring the continuation of the Union and prevent the plague of sectionalism. Henry Clay first ran in 1824 against Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, and William Crawford. Clay lost, and his political ally, John Quincy Adams, was elected president. He appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Clay's next bid for the presidency was in 1832 against incumbent President Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay felt Jackson abused his power and threatened to split the country when he butted heads with his vice president, John Calhoun. Clay said about Andrew Jackson, "He is ignorant, passionate, hypocritical, corrupt, and easily swayed by the basest men who surround him." However, Clay lost, and Jackson won a second presidential term. After losing two primary elections to William Henry Harrison, Clay ran against James Polk and his rhetoric of manifest destiny. James Polk promised to expand the United States by taking control of the territory of Oregon and provoking war with Mexico. Clay believed that the new territory would destroy the U.S. by reopening the question of slavery that had been mostly resolved by his congressional compromise. The allure of land westward was too strong, and Clay lost the election by just a few thousand votes in the swing state of New York. This was Clay's final presidential bid. The American people were enamored by other candidates' materialistic promises, and Clay could not compete. Despite these defeats, Clay was still the most respected member of Congress and kept the fight for compromise alive. Henry Clay delicately dealt with three major instances of sectionalism in the United States Congress by allowing for compromises that placated both sides. The Compromise of 1820 was the first of many artful compromises. America was expanding west, and the territories were becoming more and more organized. Citizens of these areas deliberated if the territory would be admitted to the Union as a free or slave state. This debate reached the Congress, where a compromise was formed, largely by the speeches of Henry Clay. This compromise, dubbed the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise, preserved the balance of free and slave states by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine, previously a territory of Massachusetts, as a free state. The second resolution in Congress was the Compromise of 1833. This compromise sprouted after a confrontation between President Andrew Jackson and Vice President John Calhoun. Calhoun resisted high tariffs in his home state, South Carolina. Jackson passed a force bill, and this authorized him to use military action in South Carolina, which he planned to lead. Clay knew this divisive decision could cause a civil war and worked quickly to create the Compromise of 1833. This compromise lessened the impact of the tariffs by slowly introducing them during an extended period of time. This measure worked, and Jackson did not move troops into South Carolina. The crisis was averted. 17 years later, after Polk had secured what is now the southwestern United States, the issue of sectionalism was reignited as Congress argued over whether these states should be free or slave. As Southerners, such as Calhoun, threatened secession, Clay set in place the monumental Compromise of 1850. This compromise had 5 major points: admit California as a free state, abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C., reinforce the fugitive slave laws, or laws requiring the recapture of slaves who had escaped, reorganize the newly seceded from Mexico American Southwest Territory and the Texan Territory, allow new territories to decide, through popular sovereignty, if they wanted slavery or freedom. Congressional compromise strengthened the Union because of their skillful creation and presentation by Henry Clay that appeased both Northerners and Southerners and would have allowed the country to stay united. Henry Clay stood against sectionalism by inciting national spirit, running for president, and crafting compromises in Congress. These acts of cooperation, spearheaded by Henry Clay, were the last hope in keeping the antebellum Union intact. Unfortunately, all the congressmen who worked to unite the country died shortly after the Compromise of 1850. Nevertheless, even after Clay's death on June 29, 1852, his legacy continued to help the Unionist cause in America. Clay inspired many staunch Unionists, such as Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, who would eventually become allies during the Civil War to preserve the Union. Lincoln said in his eulogy to Clay, "Alas, who can realize that Henry Clay is dead? Who can realize that never again that majestic form shall rise in the council chamber of his country to beat back the storms of anarchy, which may threaten or pour the oil of peace upon the troubled billows as they rage and menace around?"